I am writing these words without certainty about how they will be received, and without certainty about how I myself should name what happened. I am not a Christian. I do not pray to Jesus as God. In my faith, he is Ibn Maryam, a prophet of truth and restraint, a servant of the one God, not an object of worship. I say this clearly because what follows is not a sermon, and it is not an attempt to borrow another people's belief. It began on a night when my body had reached a limit I did not know it had. Hours of security briefings, reports of threats, the quiet weight of decisions that can cost lives. Power does not arrive like thunder. It arrives like exhaustion. By the time I lay down, I was not seeking revelation. I was seeking sleep. What came instead felt like neither dream nor vision in the way people usually describe such things. There was no light, no voice from the sky. There was simply presence. A man standing where I did not expect anyone to be. He looked like a man from our shared region of the world. Not painted, not elevated, not glowing. His clothes were worn. His face carried dust and patience. His eyes did not accuse me, but they did not excuse me either. I did not feel invited to believe. I felt summoned to look. He did not say my name. He did not ask for my allegiance. He said only this, calmly, as if stating a law of nature. Power bends the soul before it breaks it, and most souls do not notice the bending. I remember wanting to argue. I remember wanting to explain myself, my intentions, the reasons that brought me where I stand, but explanations collapse when you are no longer speaking to an audience. They collapse when you are alone with consequence. What followed was not a lesson about heaven. It was a confrontation with direction, a showing, not of what people preach about hell, but of what leadership becomes when it forgets service and begins to worship control. I cannot prove this came from God. I cannot prove it came from my mind. That question no longer interests me. What matters is that everything I was shown was true. And truth once seen does not leave you. When the scene shifted, there was no sound of movement, yet I knew I was no longer where I had been. I was not being carried. I was being allowed to follow. The man I recognized as Jesus did not gesture dramatically. He simply walked, and I understood that I could either walk with him or remain alone. I followed. What I saw first was not fire. That surprised me. There was darkness, but not the absence of light, rather the absence of relief. A heaviness pressed against the senses, as if the air itself remembered pain. I understood then that this place was not designed to frighten. It was designed to reveal. I saw figures before I understood who they were. Their faces were familiar in a way that unsettled me deeply. Some I recognized clearly. Others I recognized by posture, by the way power still clung to them like a habit they could not abandon. These were leaders. Men who once spoke of liberation, security, sovereignty, reform. Men who were applauded, saluted, feared. They were not being tortured by demons, they were being confronted by themselves. One reached endlessly toward piles of gold and documents, toward symbols of wealth and influence. Each time his fingers touched them, they dissolved into ash. He did not scream. He sighed again and again in the exhaustion of a hunger that could never be satisfied. I understood without being told he had chosen wealth over people, transactions over trust. He had gained everything except rest. Another relived moments of violence, not as a commander issuing orders, but as every victim at once. Each shot, each scream, each final breath replayed itself through him. His body carried the memory of what his authority had permitted. Power had insulated him in life. It did not protect him here. There were others who stood surrounded by crowds yet could not touch a single soul. They spoke, but no one heard. They reached, but nothing responded. These were the ones who traded their nations quietly, who signed away dignity behind closed doors. In life, they were never alone. In this place, they knew only isolation. What terrified me most was not recognizing them. It was recognizing myself in fragments of them. I felt no condemnation from the one walking beside me. That absence was heavier than accusation. He did not say, "You will become this." He said quietly, "This is how it begins." He showed me the path as a progression, not a fall. First, the belief that urgency justifies shortcuts, then the belief that enemies excuse cruelty, then the belief that control is the same as order. No single step looked like betrayal. Each one felt reasonable, necessary even. I realized then why this experience did not demand belief. It demanded honesty. And honesty for a leader is the rarest discipline of all. The man beside me did not hurry me. He never pulled my arm or raised his voice. He allowed silence to do what force never could. In that silence, I began to understand that what I was being shown was not a destination prepared for monsters, but a mirror prepared for rulers. He led me to a place where the weight was heaviest. Here were those who called themselves protectors. Their backs were bent under chains they could not see while they lived. Each chain bore the shape of a decision once defended as necessary. Emergency laws that never ended. Enemies defined so broadly that entire peoples disappeared beneath the word. Order achieved by fear, then defended by habit. They could not stand upright. Not because someone punished them, but because they had forgotten how. When you rule long enough without listening, your spine learns submission to its own authority. Freedom taken from others eventually forgets how to live anywhere, even inside you. I felt something break in me then. Not belief, but pride. I saw how easily I could justify the same weight. I had already learned the language. Security, stability, transition. I had already felt the applause that comes when people are afraid and desperate enough to mistake firmness for righteousness. The man I call Jesus did not condemn authority. He condemned forgetting why it exists. He showed me images of people I do not know by name but recognize by need. A woman waiting hours for water. A child whose hunger had become so normal it no longer cried. A farmer whose land produced wealth for others while his own family shrank. He showed me these not as accusations but as anchors. This, he said, is what keeps power upright. I understood then that corruption is not always theft. Sometimes it is distance. Sometimes it is the slow replacement of faces with figures, lives with reports. You stop stealing money and begin stealing time, dignity, voice. You tell yourself it is temporary. History is built on temporary excuses that never expired. He showed me a different future, not as promise but as possibility. A country where projects are built because they are needed, not because they can be exploited. Where leadership is measured by absence of fear, not presence of control. Where strength is quiet enough that it does not need to announce itself. I wanted to ask how to guarantee this path. He answered before I spoke. There are no guarantees, he said. Only choices, made again each day. When the scene began to fade, I realized the most frightening truth of all. Hell, as I was shown, is not imposed, it is arrived at. And leadership decides the direction long before the arrival is visible. When the scene shifted again, I was no longer looking outward, I was looking inward. This was the most difficult part, because no leader is trained to interrogate his own justifications. We are trained to defend them. The man beside me showed no impatience. He did not speak of sins in the language of religion. He spoke of erosion, the way water reshapes stone without ever announcing its intention. He showed me how no leader wakes up planning to become an oppressor. The transformation begins with efficiency. You tell yourself that listening takes too long. That debate weakens resolve. That transparency invites sabotage. You begin to replace consent with compliance, believing the result will be the same. It never is. I saw moments from my own life, not as accusations but as warnings. Times when I felt the pull to silence dissent rather than endure it. Moments when the phrase "for now" became a shelter for actions I would not want to defend later. Power, I learned, does not intoxicate. It numbs. He showed me leaders who once spoke like servants and later spoke only like commanders. Their language changed before their actions did. Words like "we" quietly became "I." Words like "people" became assets. Responsibility narrowed until it could fit inside ambition. In one place, I saw those who had ordered violence believing distance would absolve them. They did not hold the weapon. They signed the paper. They gave the signal. In this place, distance had no meaning. Every life taken returned as memory, not to torture but to remind. Authority does not dilute responsibility, it concentrates it. I wanted to look away. He did not stop me, but he said this: if you cannot look now, you will look later, one way or another. Then he showed me the most dangerous compromise of all. The moment when a leader begins to believe he is irreplaceable. When survival of the nation becomes confused with survival of the ruler. At that moment, every criticism sounds like betrayal, and every restraint feels like sabotage. This is where revolutions betray themselves. I understood then that hell is not merely punishment, it is clarity without the ability to change. It is seeing exactly where you turned and knowing the road behind you is closed. Before the vision released me, he offered no command. He offered a reminder. You will not be judged by what you overthrew, he said. You will be judged by what you become. That sentence stayed with me long after the images faded. When the weight finally lifted, I realized something important. What I had been shown was not fixed. None of it was sealed. If this were a sentence, it would have ended differently. Instead, it paused. The man beside me stopped walking. For the first time, he turned fully toward me. His expression did not soften, but it did not harden either. It carried something rarer than mercy and stricter than judgment. It carried expectation. He showed me another road, not glowing, not idealized. It was ordinary, dusty, difficult. A road where leaders remained human by refusing to become symbols, where authority was exercised slowly enough to feel its cost, where fear was treated as a warning sign, not a tool. He showed me people again, but this time not as victims. I saw farmers whose land finally served their families, children whose education was not a slogan but a daily reality, elders whose voices mattered again because they were listened to, not because they were quoted. I noticed something that surprised me. In this vision of strength, the leader was less visible. His name was not everywhere, his image did not dominate walls. His presence was felt through stability, not spectacle. I asked without speaking whether this road required perfection. He answered without hesitation. No, he said. It requires repentance in motion. He showed me moments when leaders stopped themselves mid-decision, when they reversed course publicly, when they admitted error without collapsing authority. I realized then that humility does not weaken leadership, it stabilizes it. Then came the words I did not expect, words that felt heavier than any warning. You will be tempted, he said, to believe you are alone. You are not, but you will always choose alone. And then he showed me something beyond the vision itself. I saw myself waking. Not dramatically, not changed into a saint. Simply awake, carrying the memory like a stone in my chest. When I opened my eyes in the real world, the room was quiet. Dawn had not yet broken. For a long moment, I sat still, letting my breathing return to its rhythm. I told myself what any rational man would tell himself: exhaustion, stress, the mind protecting itself through symbolism. I would have dismissed it entirely if it had ended there. It did not. Later that same day, while I was still unsettled, my aide informed me that an old man wished to speak with me urgently. A retired military leader, long removed from power, known not for ambition but for conscience. A man who had once served as a spiritual counselor to Thomas Sankara. I almost declined. Time is the currency leaders spend most carelessly. Something told me not to. When he spoke, his voice was steady, unembellished. He did not ask how I was, he did not flatter me. He said, "Last night, I dreamed of hell." I did not interrupt him. He described leaders he recognized. He described wealth turning to ash. He described isolation surrounded by crowds. He described burdens that bent men who once stood tall. Then he said something that removed all doubt from my bones. He described the man who walked beside me. He could not have known. He had no reason to invent. The timing matched, the details matched, even the restraint matched. He ended by saying, "This was not about religion, it was about responsibility." When the call ended, I understood that the question of origin no longer mattered. The warning had been doubled. And warnings repeated are not coincidences. After that call, I did not feel fear. I felt exposure. There is a difference. Fear makes you hide. Exposure makes you examine what you have been hiding from yourself. For the first time since assuming authority, I asked a question I had postponed. Not how do I win? Not how do I survive? But what does this position demand of my soul? The man I encountered in that night did not speak again, yet his presence lingered as a discipline. I began to notice how power constantly asks for payment. It rarely asks all at once. It asks in installments, small enough to feel manageable. One silence here, one tolerated injustice there, one delay that quietly becomes permanent. Power rewards compliance immediately. It punishes conscience slowly. I began to see how leaders become prisoners of their own necessity. The more they rely on force, the more force they require. The more they centralize authority, the more fragile the system becomes without them. Eventually, the state exists to protect the ruler, not the people. At that moment, collapse is only a matter of time, even if the collapse arrives long after applause fades. What disturbed me most was how easily good intentions become armor. We tell ourselves we are different because we began with sacrifice, because we speak the language of dignity, because we overthrew something unjust. But history is filled with men who began as answers and ended as warnings. The man I saw did not ask me to abandon leadership. He asked me to remember its cost. Leadership is not ownership, it is custody. You are holding something that belongs to others, and one day it will be taken back. He showed me that every order I give travels farther than I can see. It enters homes I will never visit. It reshapes lives I will never meet. In that sense, leadership is the most intimate act imaginable, because it touches strangers at their most vulnerable moments. I realized then why the visions of suffering were so specific. They were not meant to shock. They were meant to educate. Each punishment mirrored a choice. Each burden reflected a theft. Each isolation echoed a betrayal. This was not about theology, it was about alignment. I began to understand something my faith has always taught, but leaders often forget. God does not need our power. God tests what we do with it. We are not asked to be saviors. We are asked to be servants who do not confuse themselves with destiny. What steadied me was not fear of hell, it was clarity about consequence. If I fail, I will not fail alone. Others will pay before I do. That realization stripped ambition of its romance. I began to speak differently after that. I listened longer. I delayed decisions that would have flattered strength but weakened justice, not always perfectly, never effortlessly, but consciously. Because power that is not examined becomes power that consumes. And once it consumes, it demands everything. In the final movement of what I was shown, there were no scenes of suffering. There were no leaders, no crowds, no symbols of authority at all. There was only a voice, not loud, not distant, but firm in a way that did not require repetition. It was not addressed to me alone. It was addressed to every age that believes it has finally mastered history. I am still God, the voice said, not in anger. In fact, the calmness was what made it unshakable. Human beings do not replace me, they never have. I understood then that the deepest corruption of power is not violence or greed, it is substitution. The moment a leader begins to act as if he is the final source of order, justice, or meaning, he has crossed a line no constitution can restrain. The voice did not deny human agency, it clarified it. I act through people, it said. I always have. But then came the part that silenced every argument I had ever rehearsed in my mind. And I also intervened directly. There was no threat in this, only reality. I realized how often leaders comfort themselves with the idea that history belongs entirely to strategy. That outcomes are the product of cleverness, alliances, pressure, timing. These things matter, but they are not sovereign. They do not own the final word. The voice continued, and each sentence stripped away another illusion. Nothing is impossible for me. I had heard these words before, in scriptures, in speeches, in prayers. I had never heard them applied to restraint, to removal, to reversal. Then came the sentence that unsettled me most deeply. Fear does not come from me. I saw then how much of leadership is built on fear, even when it pretends to oppose it. Fear of enemies, fear of instability, fear of losing control, fear dressed up as realism, fear that slowly trains a leader to trust coercion more than conscience. The voice did not promise safety, it promised presence. It did not guarantee success, it guaranteed accountability. In that moment, I understood prayer differently, not as a ritual meant to persuade God, but as an act that reshapes timing, a way of aligning action with something larger than urgency. The voice made this clear without ceremony. I know what I will do, it said, but I invite my children to work with me. That invitation was heavier than any command. It meant responsibility without illusion. It meant that delay, humility, restraint, and courage were not weaknesses, but forms of cooperation. When the voice fell silent, nothing dramatic followed. No closing vision, no instruction manual. Only the knowledge that power exists inside a framework it did not build and cannot dismantle. I returned fully to myself then, carrying not fear, but a burden of awareness. Awareness is not comfortable. It does not let you hide behind necessity or momentum. It demands choice, again and again, and that is why it endures. I write these words without knowing how they will be received, and without knowing what name history will eventually give to what happened to me. I do not write to persuade, I do not write to defend myself. I write because silence, after what I saw, would be another form of betrayal. I am not a Christian. I do not pray to Jesus as God. In my faith, he is Wesa ibn Maryam, a prophet of restraint, of truth spoken without ornament, a servant of the one God who warned rulers more often than he comforted them. I state this clearly, not to distance myself from anyone, but to make one thing unmistakable. What follows is not a sermon, and it is not an attempt to borrow another people's belief to clothe my own authority. It began on a night when my body and my mind reached a limit I did not know existed, not a dramatic breaking point, but the quiet collapse that comes after responsibility has been carried too long without rest. There had been hours of briefings, maps marked with threats, reports layered upon reports, each one demanding attention because lives depended on decisions made quickly and without hesitation. Power does not arrive like thunder. It does not announce itself with lightning or spectacle. Power arrives like exhaustion. It arrives when the body is too tired to argue with the mind, and the mind is too tired to question its own certainty. By the time I lay down, I was not seeking revelation. I was not praying for signs. I was seeking sleep, oblivion, if I am honest, a temporary absence from the weight of command. What came instead did not resemble the visions people describe when they want to impress an audience. There was no blinding light, no celestial voice tearing through the sky. There was only presence. A man stood where no man should have been. He did not look like the paintings that dominate Western imagination. He was not elevated above the ground, not wrapped in radiance. He looked like a man from our shared region of the world, ordinary, dust-marked. His clothes were worn, as if they had traveled many roads. His face carried patience rather than drama. His eyes were deep, not accusing, not indulgent. They did not excuse me. They did not condemn me. They simply saw me. I did not feel invited to believe anything. I felt summoned to look. He did not say my name. He did not ask for my allegiance. He did not speak of salvation or damnation. He spoke one sentence, calmly, as if stating a law older than any constitution or creed. Power bends the soul before it breaks it, he said, and most souls do not notice the bending. I remember the urge to respond, to explain myself, to list intentions, sacrifices, enemies, necessities. Leaders are trained to explain. We are trained to justify. We are trained to speak as if context absolves consequence. But explanations collapse when there is no audience to convince. They collapse when you are alone with what follows your decisions rather than the applause that precedes them. What came next was not a lesson about heaven, it was not theology, it was direction. A confrontation not with what people preach about hell, but with what leadership becomes when it forgets service and begins, quietly, to worship control. I was shown a place that was heavy rather than fiery, dark, not because light was absent, but because relief was. The air itself seemed to remember suffering. This place did not exist to frighten. It existed to reveal. I saw figures before I recognized who they were. Their faces were familiar in ways that unsettled me deeply. Some I recognized clearly. Others I recognized by posture, by the way authority still clung to them like a habit that death itself could not break. They were leaders. Men who once spoke of liberation, of sovereignty, of reform. Men who stood behind podiums and flags. Men who were applauded, saluted, feared. Men whose names filled newspapers and chants. They were not being tortured by demons. They were being confronted by themselves. One reached endlessly toward piles of gold, documents, contracts, symbols of wealth and influence. Each time his fingers touched them, they dissolved into ash. He did not scream. He sighed, again and again, in the exhaustion of a hunger that could never be satisfied. I understood without being told. He had chosen transactions over trust, accumulation over people. He had gained everything except rest. Another relived violence, not as a commander issuing orders from a distance, but as every victim at once. Each bullet, each scream, each final breath passed through him. His body carried the memory of what his authority had permitted. Power had insulated him in life. It did not protect him here. There were others who stood surrounded by crowds yet could not touch a single soul. They spoke, but no one heard. They reached, but nothing responded. These were the ones who traded their nations quietly, who signed away dignity behind closed doors. In life they were never alone. In this place they knew only isolation. What terrified me most was not recognizing them. It was recognizing myself in fragments of them. I felt no condemnation from the one walking beside me. That absence was heavier than accusation. He did not say, "You will become this." He said quietly, "This is how it begins." He showed me the path not as a fall but as a progression. First, the belief that urgency justifies shortcuts. Then the belief that enemies excuse cruelty. Then the belief that control is the same as order. No single step looked like betrayal. Each one felt reasonable, necessary even. I understood then why this experience did not demand belief. It demanded honesty. And honesty for a leader is the rarest discipline of all. He led me further, to a place where the weight was heaviest. Here were those who called themselves protectors. Their backs were bent under chains they could not see while alive. Each chain bore the shape of a decision once defended as necessary. Emergency laws that never ended. Enemies defined so broadly that entire peoples vanished beneath a word. They could not stand upright. Not because someone punished them, but because they had forgotten how. When you rule long enough without listening, your spine learns submission to its own authority. Freedom taken from others eventually forgets how to live anywhere, even inside you. Something broke in me then, not belief, but pride. I saw how easily I could justify the same weight. I had already learned the language, security, stability, transition. I had already felt the applause that comes when people are afraid and desperate enough to mistake firmness for righteousness. The man beside me did not condemn authority, he condemned forgetting why it exists. He showed me people I did not know by name but recognized by need. A woman waiting hours for water. A child whose hunger had become so normal it no longer cried. A farmer whose land enriched others while his own family shrank. These were not accusations. They were anchors. This, he said, is what keeps power upright. I understood then that corruption is not always theft. Sometimes it is distance. Sometimes it is the slow replacement of faces with figures, lives with reports. You stop stealing money and begin stealing time, dignity, voice. You tell yourself it is temporary. History is built on temporary excuses that never expired. He showed me another road, not glowing, not idealized, dusty, difficult. A road where leaders remained human by refusing to become symbols. Where authority was exercised slowly enough to feel its cost. Where fear was treated as a warning sign, not a tool. I asked without speaking whether this road required perfection. No, he said. It requires repentance in motion. I saw leaders stop themselves mid-decision, reverse course publicly, admit error without collapsing authority. I understood then that humility does not weaken leadership, it stabilizes it. Then came the words that stayed with me longer than any image. You will be tempted to believe you are alone, he said. You are not, but you will always choose alone. I woke quietly, no drama, no holiness, just awareness, heavy as stone in the chest. I told myself what any rational man would tell himself: exhaustion, stress, the mind protecting itself with symbolism. I would have dismissed it if it had ended there. It did not. Later that day, an old man asked to speak with me. A retired military leader, known not for ambition but for conscience. Once a spiritual counselor to Thomas Sankara. I almost declined. Time is the currency leaders waste most carelessly. Something told me not to. He spoke simply. Last night, he said, I dreamed of hell. He described leaders I recognized, wealth turning to ash, isolation among crowds, burdens bending men who once stood tall. Then he described the man who walked beside me. He could not have known. The timing matched, the details matched, even the restraint matched. This was not about religion, he said. It was about responsibility. After that call, I felt no fear. I felt exposure. Fear makes you hide. Exposure forces you to examine. For the first time, I asked the question I had postponed. Not how to win, not how to survive, but what this position demands of my soul. Power asks for payment. Slowly, in installments, one silence here, one tolerated injustice there. Power rewards compliance immediately. It punishes conscience slowly. Leadership is not ownership, it is custody. One day, what you hold will be taken back. In the final moment, there were no images at all, only a voice. I am still God. Human beings do not replace that role. They never have. Fear does not come from him. Prayer, I learned, does not change God's will, it changes alignment. God knows what he will do, but he still invites human beings to walk correctly while history unfolds. I remain a Muslim. I did not convert. What changed was not my theology, but my relationship with power. To Christians, I say this respectfully. The Jesus I encountered did not demand worship. He demanded honesty. To Muslims, I say this plainly. Authority is a trust, not a prize. To leaders everywhere, when the applause fades, what remains of you? Nations do not collapse first through invasion, they collapse through justification. What I saw of hell was not fire meant to terrify believers, it was clarity meant to terrify the powerful. What I saw of hope was quieter, found in restraint, in listening, in leaders small enough to correct themselves. I do not promise perfection, I promise vigilance. Each morning, I wake up and must choose again. There is no final victory, only awareness or surrender.